Filipe Santos, Executive Pastor of Ministries, Echo Church. Filipe Santos is one of the founding pastors of South Bay Church, now known as Echo Church. Since its launch in 2009, they now reach over 2,500 people in regular attendance and have grown to 3 separate locations across the Silicon Valley. Familiar with the challenges that church planters face with a diverse cultural demographic, Pastor Santos strives to cultivate church success by sharing his personal experience and resources to all, such as Frontline Coaching, which offers direction and training for executive pastors, and Multiply Group, geared towards church growth. Pastor Santos proves to be successful at bringing hearts and minds together. Pastor Santos and his wife Mandy have 5 children. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a heartfelt welcome to Pastor Filipe Santos.
As the video said, I'm Filipe. I am from Brazil originally, and I've been half my life now in America. But I first came as a foreigner, and I've experienced a lot of different parts of the United States. Lived in Michigan a little bit, lived in New Jersey a little bit, South Carolina, and then I've been in California now for 10 years. And my wife and I have 5 children. 3 are biological. 2 of them we adopted 4 years ago. So we have 5 kids in our home. And it's a pretty intense home as well. So 8 to 14 years old, lots of activity and noise all around us all the time. Hey, I want to start by just saying thank you to the people that invested in starting this conference and all the energy. I know we already thanked them once, but can we thank them one more time? Because it was a lot of work. And I know that every time we do something controversial, there are people that stand against what we do. And some people pay the price every single time something like this happens. And then I just want to acknowledge the fact that it's pretty awesome that you're here. And I was actually thanking God all week for the people that would come simply because of this. Every movement of God in a city, in a community, in a neighborhood, it starts with the few. Very rarely does it start with the masses. It starts with a few that say, we're going to unite around a cause. And we're going to believe together, and we're going to figure this out together in conversation in a honorable, respectful way. And when we do this, things always change. And so I'm proud of you for being a part of this as well. So the title of the short talk I have is How the Gospel Can Shake the Church into Racial Reconciliation, Racial Justice. And I want to just start by saying, just kind of helping us understand together what the gospel really is for just a minute. I know most of us here have some sort of a church background, but just for the sake of unifying around this, just a reminder for us of what the gospel is. The gospel is the good news of Jesus. It is the fact that he came out of heaven, emptied himself of glory, took the form of a human being like us, flesh and blood, lived the life that we could not live, that died a brutal death on the cross, carrying the sins of humanity upon his shoulders, of every single human being. And on that cross, he conquered sin itself. So that no longer we have a restriction between us and God, but we can go into the presence of God. And not only did he do that, but 3 days later, he was raised from the dead, which is good news for us. Because it wasn't just sin that he solved, it was death that he solved. And so he looked death in the face and says, you are conquered, and all of these people that I love can now overcome death because of my blood. That's the good news of Jesus. Now, there are some powerful illustrations and visuals that scriptures give us of what this gospel is about and what it does in our lives as it relates to others and to God himself. And I want to talk about 2 symbols. It's very simple. Most of you have heard this before, but I'm praying that God will kind of give us a new perspective based on these 2 illustrations. And all of these symbolically represent a truth that I want to repeat over and over again in our time together. And it simply goes like this, that the gospel tears down that which divides, but it unites that which has been divided. Does that make sense? The gospel tears down the things that divide, that stand between us, And it absolutely unites that which has been divided. And I'm going to illustrate this with two specific symbols that were in the temple of Jerusalem at the time that Jesus came to the earth. And you might have heard this before. There's going to be a picture on your screen. But in the Jerusalem temple, there are all these symbols that were illustrating our relationship with God and our relationship with people. And the writer of Hebrews talks about this. He says the temple was way more than just brick and mortar. It was an illustration. It was like a book proposal before the book was written, or the blueprints of a bigger story before it was actually written or released. And after it was fulfilled, it said that that whole temple idea would no longer be useful. But up to this point, they didn't quite get this. And there were a couple of things in the temple that were very, very significant. And particularly, I want to talk about a curtain and a wall. A curtain and a wall. Can we say that together? A curtain and a wall. And the curtain is a curtain that was torn, and the wall is a wall that was broken. And this is very, very important for us to understand. Now, the temple illustrated our pathway to God, and it illustrated a lot of other things, our pathway to each other, God's pathway into our hearts. But we know a couple of things happened in the temple when Jesus came to earth. In fact, it was very confusing to the first generation of people watching the message of Jesus unfold before their eyes. See, the temple was like the center of worship to these people. But on the cross, a couple of things happened to the temple that are very, very important for us to understand. And I want to read to you what it says. In Mark 15, this is Jesus already brutally hurt, beard ripped off his face, bloody on a cross. Last few seconds of his life. It says this in Mark 15:38. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this was the Son of God." There's something that happened. There's a reason why it says this about the curtain. And if you know the temple, how it was structured, there are a couple things in there that were really significant for us. The temple had a courtyard. And in the courtyard, there was a wall that we'll talk about in just a second that separated some people from going in. But then once you went in to the temple itself, there was a place called the holy place. It was like coming into like the lobby area of a church facility. And the holy place, only a few could go into that place. But then there's another inner room after the holy place called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. It's where the Ark of the Covenant lived. It symbolically represented the presence of God. And between the holy place and the most holy place, there was a huge curtain, 30 feet wide, 60 feet high, thick curtain. And that curtain, year after year after year after year, reminded people that not everybody gets to go to God. Only the high priest can go in there. Once a year, through this rigorous cleansing that he had to go through. And if there's any sin that was undealt with, when he walked into this place, there were little bells on his robe that would ring when he would be struck dead in the Holy of Holies. It was a reminder to them, not everybody gets access to God yet. But at the same time, it was a reminder that someday, all people would be able to get there. But year after year after year, that curtain reminded the people there's only a select few that get to have access, that are valued enough to come into the presence. But then, on the cross, something very beautiful happened. And I think it disrupted a lot of people's hearts. In fact, imagine all these religious people that were used to their separation. We are a little bit better than you. You know, our race is a little bit better than yours. Our spirituality is a little bit closer to God than yours. All of a sudden, that one thing that represented that separation from top to bottom, ripped. Something very important happened. For generation after generation, the one thing that separated them was ripped. Because the gospel tears down that which divides. And that day, they were reminded since power was broken and death has been conquered. When it happened, I love the fact that it was from top to bottom. You see, there's a part of this conversation that cannot really unfold unless God is in it. There's a part of all of this that is too deep for humans to solve on their own, and Jesus had to come and do it himself. And he's still doing it all over and over and over and over again. But the top to bottom just reminds us, hey, this is the heart of God we're talking about. This is not like the heart of men. I really appreciate Martin Luther, and I appreciate all the people that have paved the way for reconciliation, and it moves all of us, but he was only significant because he got a glimpse of the heart of God, correct? When we get into the heart of God, we understand that he tears top to bottom the things that divide us from one another. And then look at what it says in Hebrews 10:19. It says, "So dear brothers and sisters, we can now all boldly enter heaven's most holy place because of the blood of Jesus." So that most holy place, the presence of God, we can now enter because of the blood. By his death, Jesus opened a new, life-giving way through the curtain and in the most holy place. And since we have a high priest, he became the high priest who rules over all God's house. Let us go right into the presence of God with sincere hearts, trusting him. But then there's a little warning at the end. Verse 26, it says, "But dear brothers, if we deliberately continue sinning after receiving this knowledge of truth, there's no sacrifice that will cover that sin." In other words, at this moment, when it was all ripped, he's saying this nonsense of division, it's over. And once we've received the revelation and we continue in the sin of it, we're basically saying that the sacrifice of the gospel means nothing to us. Because this was an act of God, not an act of humans. Now, there was another part of this that's really significant. See, the temple had this wall. And the wall, we still have a lot of these walls. But in their day, the wall represented a racial division. See, there were the Jews and then there were the Gentiles. And the Gentiles could not approach the temple of God. It was called the wall of hostility by the Apostle Paul, because this wall represented a lot of tension between races in their day. But I love what happened at the cross. Listen to this. Now, you have been united with Christ, Ephesians 2. Once you were far away, he's talking to the Gentiles from God, but now you've been brought near to him through the blood of Christ. For Christ himself has brought peace to us, and he united both Jews and Gentiles, all the races, their separation, into one people in his own body on the cross. And he broke down the wall of hostility that separated us, because the gospel tears down that which divides, and it unites what has been divided. And on the cross, not only was there a vertical unification process that happened, not only did Jesus tear down the vertical wall where all people now can come to him, there was also a physical wall that symbolically represented a division between people. And he says that wall has been destroyed. He's knocked it down. And no longer you have to have any position, special position to get to God. No longer is there preference or privilege based on race. The wall is down. In their culture, their biggest division was Jew and Gentile, which that wall represented. In our culture, there's a lot of other ones now. But it's the same wall. Several years ago, archaeologists found an inscription in the wall of the outermost court. And it said, "Whoever is captured," speaking to Gentiles, "past this point will have himself to blame for his subsequent death." Inscribed in a religious wall. It's a little bit sickening, isn't it? But it's the same sickening that we experience when we hear the stories like what Mike Stewart just shared with us. There's this, like, how can it be that people of God would do things like this? Because when you really get the gospel and you know that The thing that happened right there at the climax of it all on the cross was God reminding people that this curtain is ripped and that this wall is broken. How can we continue in the old ways of thinking? See, that which divided you is what Paul's saying. From one another based on background or race, it is down. The racial segregation nonsense, it's over. It's done by the blood of Jesus, is what he's teaching the people. See, before Jesus, there were positional limits to knowing God, and there were ethnic limits to approaching him. But God shook that 2,000 years ago. And he still calls the church to be the ones that shake it out of culture today. See, what Jesus started wasn't just for the first century. We understand that. He later commissioned people to go and continue the good news, which means we have to continue to rip the curtain off the temple and to bring down the wall everywhere we go. I love it when God shakes things. In fact, in Hebrews, he prophetically spoke of Jesus coming as one who would shake things that are supposed to be shaken. And in Hebrews 12, it says this: when God spoke on Mount Sinai, and his voice shook the earth. But now, he makes another promise. He says, once again, I'm going to shake not only the earth, but the heavens. He says, this means that all of creation will be shaken and removed, so that only unshakable things remain: the souls of people, the message of Jesus, the love of God. He's going to shake things until everything that's dividing and standing in the way of what he wants to accomplish is going to be down. And since we're receiving a kingdom that's unshakable, let us be thankful and please God by worshiping him with holy fear and awe. See, Jesus, he brought together Jews and Gentiles. He brought together men and women. He brought together children with adults in a culture that belittled children. He brought together the poor and the rich and the sinner and the sanctified at the same time. He brought together the sick and the healthy, and every division that people had in their days between one another, Jesus would go and break it down and break it down and break it down. Remember, when you read the Gospels, that's what he would do. That guy, nobody's touching that guy. I'm going to go touch him. That woman, nobody's approaching because she's from a different race. I'm going to approach her. That person who's sick that nobody wants to be near, I'm going to go ahead and be near. Jesus broke every single wall, and it ticked some people off, didn't it? And it causes tension every single time. A few years ago, my daughter came up from school. I have a blonde, as white as you can imagine, little girl. Beautiful, and she's in a school where it's very racially diverse, which I absolutely love. And she came home one day. Actually, I'm driving the car home, and they had been learning about Martin Luther that day, Martin Luther King. And in the car, she said, "Daddy, today we learned about Martin Luther King Jr." And I said, "Man, that's awesome." And she said, "Daddy, am I black?" And I look back. Like, I'm driving. I look back, because she's the more tan of our kids. Like, she's a little bit darker than the other one, but she's white, you know, like. And she said, am I black? And I was curious. What's happening in her mind? And you know what I found out? A couple things. This is just to cause a little discomfort in us, but she was asking for a few reasons. One is, she wanted to identify with Martin Luther King Jr., which I thought was pretty cool. She learned that he was a hero, and she wanted to know if she was a part of that hero tribe. The other part of her was, well, I'm a little bit darker than my sister. Does that make me black? And she was just wondering, like, how does that work? And then the other part of her is wondering, well, what exactly does this mean? Nobody taught her to be a racist. Nobody taught her to segregate. She had no idea if it was good or bad. She just knew Martin Luther King was a hero, and she wanted to know if she was a part of that tribe. And I said, you know, Lily, yeah, you're a little bit black. You got a little bit black in you. We do. We all come from the same man. Every single one of us. And then she said, Daddy, but what does it mean? What does it mean for me? And she was confused because of all of this. And it should cause a little bit of tension. But you know what's beautiful about Jesus? Jesus meets us right there where we're at. And the closer we get to him, the more that he shows us that it doesn't really matter the race, that it doesn't really matter the background, it doesn't matter the gender, it doesn't matter our past. The gospel disrupts all of that. And it breaks it down. And the gospel is a gospel that is disruptive. Sometimes the reason we stand still when we ought to move is because we think the gospel is meant to make us comfortable. But it doesn't just make us comfortable. See, when I was 15 years old dealing drugs in my school, the gospel disrupted my life. I was trying to strive for popularity, and the gospel disrupted that. When I was 17 years old, the gospel disrupted my career goals of trying to do my own thing when God started calling me into the ministry. 10 years ago, the gospel disrupted my family life when God called us to plant a church in California and move from South Carolina, where I bought a house for $150,000. And I was called to sell everything I had and come here with no guarantee of finances and to a place that was pretty expensive, that my house could not even buy a garage here. And it disrupted me. 4 years ago, it disrupted my life when my wife and I felt God calling us to adopt 2 kids that had no home, that grew up in abuse and neglect, that were abandoned by a mom and a dad that didn't care about them. And we're asking ourselves, but we already got 3. God said, are you willing to be a little uncomfortable? You see, the gospel disrupts. It is not a gospel of comfort. It shook Paul off his donkey. It shook Peter off the fisherman path to fish for people, and it shook the first century business women to fund Jesus' ministry in that day. They get a lot of credit for what happened to Jesus. It shook people like Joan of Arc to give up her life for the sake of Jesus. It shook Martin Luther King to say what he said in that video and know that his life was probably going to be the cost of his words. Let's remember the gospel is not for comfort, it's for salvation. And every time we step into a tense conversation, it's because Jesus called us to be people of reconciliation, that tear down these curtains and that tear down the walls that stand between us and God and us and people. That's the gospel. That everywhere we go, we tell people every single person matters to God. I've been meditating on this verse in Psalm 139 when David talks about how God designed us in our innermost in the innermost belly of our moms, and every detail was designed by him intentionally, and every day of our lives were written before one came to be. And then I came to this little verse that was so meaningful to me the last few weeks. So he says, my thoughts about you outnumber the grains of sand. And I thought, I think often of how often I think about God, but I haven't stopped to think lately of how much God thinks about me and about you and about the person that's different than me and about the poor and about the people that are not in my circle of friendship and about the suffering kid who is being bullied because of race. That God's thoughts about every single one of them outnumber the grains of sand on the ocean. That's how much he loves us, and that's what shook the earth 2,000 years ago to rip a curtain and destroy a wall. And that's what Jesus calls us to do now. See, racial reconciliation is the essence of the gospel. It is not a side note of the story. It is not some kind of little note at the bottom of the essay. It is not a suggestion. It is the gospel. It is the essence of what we believe as followers of Jesus. And let me just finish by saying this. There's 2 kinds of sins in the world today. There's a sin of commission, which is we do things that we know we ought not do. But then there are sins of omission. Sins of omission is when we know we don't do the things that he does want us to do. It's when we stay silent when we're supposed to speak. It is when we say, you know what, I'm just going to stand still when God is asking us to move. And sometimes it is when we say, I'm going to pray for that when God already told us to do it. See, I don't wake up in the morning and say, God, do you want me to love my wife today? Why don't I ask that? Because He already told me that. I don't need to pray about loving my wife or about being kind to my neighbor or about being about racial reconciliation. It's not something we pray about. It's something we do. But if we're going to be honest, we're all guilty a little bit of this. See, very few here would be sinning in terms of commission because we're here today and we care about the issue. But I've been having to examine myself in this. How many times do I stay silent when I'm supposed to speak up? And it's just important to remember that there's always a cost, but the cost is always worth it. A couple years ago, when all the junk was happening in Oakland and all the racial tension was at its climax around the Bay Area, and our team got together at Echo and thought, hey, we need to speak up about this. I don't think Jesus would stand still in this case. And the conversation that came up is, well, but if we do, we're going to get a lot of junk, a lot of hate stuff. And so we went forward with it, and we organized a love rally. Pastor Port came out there to our stage, and it was beautiful, praying together with us, and it was, thousands of people uniting for the sake of racial reconciliation and unity. But I'll tell you what, in the 10 years of planting Echo Church, in 1 week, we got more hate emails and mail than 10 years of ministry that week. But you know why it doesn't matter? Because this is the gospel. Every single time we stand to tear down a wall or to rip a curtain, to take someone into the presence of God with the gospel and to remind people that they have intricate value in the eyes of God. Every single time we take a step to share the message of Jesus, we take a step to unite people that were not united before. We take a step to look in the eyes of others that people have been ignoring. Every time we do that, we're becoming like Jesus, and we're doing the very thing that He came to do, and we're shaking the earth all over again with His power. Jesus always took the first step. He intentionally built bridges. He approached, He looked in the eye, He touched, He served, He lifted human dignity and value. He taught that His kingdom ought to be advanced forcefully, intentionally on the earth. His followers were commissioned to do the same, to look at the souls of people, not the color of their skin, to be able to be known for our love, which unifies, not the hatred that divides. And Jesus did not stay silent when people were belittled. Even with little kids. Oh, don't let the kids go. Oh, wait a second. Let them come right now, please. Every single time people were belittled, Jesus spoke up for them. Children, women, poor, Gentiles, every situation, He didn't wait for something to happen. This to us is just a reminder. We got to teach our kids. Let there be tension in the car when they ask, am I black? Am I white? What am I? Let there be tension. Explain the root of it. Let them see the tension. I watch videos with my kids, and they were in the living room saying, Dad, I don't know if I want to watch this. I think you should watch this. Let it cause some discomfort a little bit. Let's be reminded of what we came to the earth for, that it is broken. Stand up when we have an opportunity and take steps of unity toward uniting the things that God cares about. We represent organizations and churches that represent a lot more people than in this room. My encouragement is to not let ourselves fall into the sin of omission, but to be intentional, to take the first step, to be intentional, to embody the gospel, to let the gospel shake it a little bit, shake our churches and our organizations and our cities. Because reconciling people to their Creator and to one another is the very essence of what we believe. Because the gospel, it tears down that which divides, and it unites what's been divided. Would you stand and pray with me for just a minute? God, in one heart and in one mind, we want to ask together for grace in this. Even as we talk about this important issue that we believe You so dearly care about, would You give us the grace and the wisdom to know how to stand in the name of love, not hatred, how to build bridges and tear down walls, How, God, to bring restoration and tear down the curtains that divide people. And every time we see injustice, would you show us how to practically live it out? Would you allow the gospel to be so deep inside of our hearts, God, this message of reconciliation between humans and God and humans to one another? Would you deepen it so much that it just naturally overflows out of us? Would you cause tension inside of our homes and inside of our churches and inside of our cities, where tension might be able to break down the walls of hatred? Would you unite, Jesus? And we ask together this. Would you unite? Would you unite, Lord? Just like you sent the message from top down, that you ripped that curtain. Would you rip some curtains in our organizations and churches, Lord, so that we would be united? And we say this in the name above every name that has already shaken the earth one time, but that still shakes us every single day, the name of Jesus. Can we give him a hand?